Hello and welcome. In our last interaction, we discussed a poem by Thomas Gray, an ode on the death of a favorite cat. We discussed in that module that Thomas Gray belonged to the group of poets which are often classified as precursors of romantic poetry in English literature. In fact, we have to discuss classicism and romanticism in a bit detail to understand what do we mean by the precursors of romanticism. Romanticism was a movement in Europe in art, in music, in painting, in poetry, and in different walks of life. It was inspired by the ideas of equality, liberty, fraternity, etc. of the French Revolution. It had its seeds in the ideas of Rousseau, the French philosopher who stressed on the importance of free expression and natural ways of life. We all know that in English literature, Romanticism is said to have started from 1798 with the publication of lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge jointly. But in literature, it is quite difficult to segregate two different periods in watertight compartments. One trend of poetry gives way to the other trend of poetry, but not on a fixed date. The previous form continues well into the next form of poetry, and the future form of poetry is also palpable and visible during the period of the previous form of dominant poetry. Same is the case with classicism or neoclassical poetry of the 18th century and romantic poetry of the early 19th century. Before Wordsworth and Coleridge published their book Lyrical Ballads in 1798 to declare the arrival of romantic poetry in England, there were many who were writing poems which displayed the inherent characteristics of romantic poetry, though they were classical in form. Thomas Gray was one among them. Thomas Gray belongs to the graveyard school of English poetry, along with Edward Young and others who are known for their melancholy evocation of sorrow. Other poets who displayed different traits of romantic poetry during this period before 1798 were James Thomson, William Collins, William Cowper, Robert Burns, and George Crabbe. In fact, James Thomson was the first to publish his poem Seasons in 1730 that brought the love of nature to the center of poetic composition. In 18th century, nature had taken the back seat. Society and politics were the main subject matter that appealed to the poets of that time, as we find in the poems by Alexander Pope, like Rape of the Lock, Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, or by Dryden in his poem Absalom and Achitophel, and other poems. Romantic poets were to bring nature to the center of human consciousness, to the center of human life, and Thomson was one among those few poets who did it before the real romantic poets of the first generation like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Scott, and Southey were to do it in a remarkable way. Other aspect of classical poetry was emphasis on society, not on the individual. Emphasis on generalization, not on the individual and his suffering and sorrow. We find in poems of Robert Burns, feelings take the central form. Feelings of a human being comes to the core of the poetry. Again, in poems like Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat, we find Thomas Gray discussing the death of a pet with a lot of sympathy. As also we find in another famous poem by Thomas Gray, Elsie written in a country churchyard, that he displays wonderful appreciation for the common man or the unsung heroes who blossom like wild flowers and wither away without being appreciated or noticed. Or in poems like Ode to Evening or Ode to Simplicity by William Collins, we find simple aspects of human existence, simple facts of nature being discussed with lot of grave importance, lot of gravity. In the poems like God Made the Country or The Morning Dream by William Cowper, we witness again that importance given to the simple human beings and the dreamy quality of life. And one aspect of classical poetry was lack of imagination. Though Samuel Johnson considered imagination to be the one of three important aspects of poetry, along with ideas and judgment, William Blake was to later declare that imagination alone is the divine quality that makes profound poetry possible, which was endorsed and put to theoretical paradigm by discussing fancy and imagination and primary imagination and secondary imagination by S.T. Coleridge. So such things like imagination, nature, feelings, discussion of simple human beings, discussion of sufferings and happinesses of individual persons were not to be found in the pure classical writers, or for that matter the new classical writers of the 18th century who were imitating the ancient classics. So in a way, if we say that the classical poetry were mimetic or imitative, the romantic revival was an outburst of protest or rebellion or revolt against those writers and their patterned and dignified and fixed expressions. They did not believe in the authority. They did not believe in following the patterns fixed by the forefathers. They wanted to make their own path. So a lot of freshness comes with the arrival of romantic poetry. But before the actual romantic poetry could arrive with poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge, a significant contribution was made by such poets like Thomas Gray, Edward Young, William Collins, William Cowper, and others. So, in brief, we can understand that the precursors of the romantic poetry were using classical forms of poems like mock heroic, pattern and using Latinized diction and other prevalent formal aspects of poetry of the 18th century, and in those formal aspects of classical pattern they infused a freshness of thought, a freshness of ideas, a freshness of imagination. To be sorrow was not always for them to be unhappy. Sorrow could also bring some solace. Sorrow was a matter for them to celebrate, as we find in Keats later on, how he felt at ease with death. Thank you.